All right, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning. My name is Lauren Reese, and together with my colleagues in the Environmental Change and Security Program, the Maternal Health Initiative, and Africa Program here at the Wilson Center, it's my privilege to welcome you to this morning's event on women, peace, and security in sub-Saharan Africa. For those of you joining us for the first time, I'll give you a quick word about where you're sitting. The Wilson Center is a living memorial to President Wilson. He was the only president to have a PhD, so instead of giving him a monument on the mall, the Congress mandated a think tank in his honor. So our mandate is to bridge the worlds of policy, practice, and research to inform smart and actionable foreign policy. Today's event is the third in our Africa in Transition series, which is generously supported by our partners in the Population Institute. The goal of the series is to help identify and elevate the steps that country leaders and the international development community can take to ensure a prosperous, healthy, and stable future for sub-Saharan Africa. In the first event of the series, one of the speakers stated that Africa is not in the middle of one transition, it's in the midst of several transitions. And all of these transitions are an opportunity for prosperity, an opportunity for growth, and an opportunity to build human capital. In that first event, speakers focused on the role of employment and education in helping African countries realize the demographic dividend. The second event of the series focused on how innovative media campaigns, in particular radio and television dramas, can be leveraged to inspire positive social change. Today's speakers are going to talk about the role of women in peace and security in sub-Saharan Africa and what steps can be taken across the development, defense, and diplomatic communities to bolster women's leadership on the continent. The event is being webcast live, so when we get to the Q&A portion, please do wait for one of my colleagues or me to hand you a mic and share your name and affiliation before posing a question. It's my pleasure to introduce Mande Mayangwa. Mande is a director of the Wilson Center's Africa program. With her team, she develops programming designed to analyze and offer practical, actionable strategies to address Africa's most critical issues and challenge the dominant narrative about Africa here in the U.S. by enhancing knowledge and understanding. Before coming to the Wilson Center in 2013, she was academic dean at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. She's also an amazing colleague and a brilliant moderator, so I'm very happy to be handing the panel over to you. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Lauren, and good morning, everyone. I wish to join Lauren in welcoming you all to the Wilson Center and to this discussion on the role of women in peace and security in Africa. It is understood and mostly accepted, though not always practiced, that a country can fully realize its development and prosperity goals only if women are included. It is also understood that a country can achieve a sustainable peace and security only if women are included. And I would argue that part of the challenges that we face on the African continent, the insecurity that we face in parts of the African continent, is precisely because not all segments of society, including and especially women, have been excluded to some extent from contributing to and benefiting from the security on the continent. You're all here because we know that Africa, like any other region, is confronted by a set of multidimensional security threats, some of them current and some of them looming over the horizon. So in our discussion here today, our panelists will touch on the key threats confronting the continent, not just here and now, but also look ahead, to look at the role that women can play and should play in the security realm in Africa, broadly defined, to highlight some of the approaches and measures that are working on the continent, but also to identify some of the challenges and offer some concrete suggestions and options for what can be done to enhance and sustain peace and security on the continent. We have an excellent panel with us this morning who are going to look at this issue from a variety of perspectives, which I believe will enhance our discussions. And it is my pleasure to welcome them and to introduce them to you now. In the interest of time, I'm going to give just a short introduction of each person, but you can find their full bios in the materials that we have provided to you. First on the panel this morning is Ambassador Philip Carter. He is an international consultant on governance, human rights, security, social and health development. He also works as a senior mentor at the U.S. Army War College's Center for Strategic Leadership, as a senior fellow at the Joint Forces Staff College, and as an adjunct faculty member at the National Defense University's Africa Center for Strategic Studies. And he is also a fellow at the Population Institute. Prior to this, Ambassador Carter had a long career in the public service and in Africa, including serving at U.S. Africa Command, at the U.S. State Department, and held several diplomatic missions, including Cote d'Ivoire and Guinea in Africa. I have known him for many years now, and I'm delighted that he is a part of this discussion. Welcome, Phil.
Thanks.
Also on the panel today is Chantel Woodruff. She is president of Women in International Security. She has also held senior positions at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C., at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research in Geneva, and she was also the founding director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, North America, an institute whose research I benefited from greatly while I was over at the National Defense University. So thank you for that. She has a long and distinguished career on issues that we'll be discussing today, and she specializes in women, peace and security, gender, international organizations, arms control and disarmament, terrorism and countering violent extremism, peacekeeping, use of force, and economic sanctions. Welcome, Chantal.
Thank you.
Our third panelist today is Elizabeth Madsen. She is a senior program director at the Population Reference Bureau, where she is the director of empowering evidence-driven advocacy. She also serves as the director of the Policy Advocacy and Communication Enhanced for Population and Reproductive Health Project. She has 16 years of research and program implementation experience, specializing in family planning and advocacy, political demography, modeling, and the intersections between population and multisectoral development. She is a longtime friend and supporter of the Wilson Center, and we're happy to see her here today, so welcome, Elizabeth. And then our fourth panelist today, certainly not the least of our distinguished panel, is Alex Eze. He is a professor of global health at Drexel University and a distinguished visiting fellow at the Center for Global Development. He was also the founding executive director of the African Population and Health Research Center. His work focuses on slum health, population dynamics in sub-Saharan Africa, and models to strengthen knowledge-based institutions in Africa. So welcome to you, Dr. Eze. So I know you didn't come here to listen to me, and so I want to get our conversation started right away. So I'll ask a question of each of our speakers to get the ball rolling, and then we can have a moderated discussion between you and our panelists for the remainder of the time. So to get our discussion underway, I want to start with you, Ambassador Carter. What do you think is widely regarded as high priority security threats facing sub-Saharan Africa? And what do you think is missing in this conversation today?
Thank you for the very easy question. It's difficult to talk about Africa as one thing, right? I mean, it's 54 countries, it's a continent, and, I think we need to kind of keep that in the back of our minds or in the forefront. Responding to the violence and threats of violent extremist organizations is such as Al-Shabaab or ISIS or Boko Haram or AQIM, is among others. That has the attention of African governments, regions, international organizations, and militaries both inside and outside of Africa. And it's clear that the suffering and the damage that these organizations have already done and are continuing to do cannot go unanswered. And, we have, that's in one tier of the continent. In the other part, you have, the issue of what I call rampaging militias, groups that are either ethnically bound or criminally bound, that are essentially creating areas of lawlessness throughout parts of the continent. And I see this mostly in Central Africa and other places. And then you have what I call the criminal networks that are taking advantage of openings in terms of either human trafficking, narcotics, weapons, cyber type of activities. And so there's a lot of stuff out there that one could define as preoccupying us in terms of priorities with regard to security on the continent. And I would suggest that, but a lot of the attention has gone to what I would call the more kinetic side of things, the terrorist threats that are arcing across from East Africa all the way across the Sahara into West Africa, and now pointing themselves into Central. But I would say that our current strategy, our military strategy of a response to these terrorist organizations is inadequate at best and probably unsustainable at worst. And that, to me, the greatest security threat, challenge, and opportunity, because they all blend together, right, is in Africa is addressing the question of governance. Poor or ineffective governance is, in many respects, I think, the thing that has to be looked at. Because if we can continue to go out and take people, as the term is, remove them from the battle space, either putting them into custody or taking them off the planet, that's whacking moles. That's only, you take out one terrorist and you create a couple more. It's not sustainable. And also the economy of warfare is a bit absurd. I mean, you're using a multi-million-dollar piece of equipment to launch a $100,000 munition against a guy wearing flip-flops, AK-47, driving a Hilux truck. I mean, really? And usually, we diminish capabilities, but only for a short time. I mean, look at al-Shabaab. How many times have we said that al-Shabaab has been eliminated, only for it to come back in a more potent form, going after innocent civilians rather than militaries? Boko Haram is a good example also. So, to me, the greatest security challenge, the thing that isn't being addressed, is the question of what are the drivers of violence? What are the drivers for all this? When you look at Tunisia, for example, where the Arab Spring started, I mean, Tunisia was one of the largest providers of foreign fighters when ISIS was in full throat effort. Tunisia, what was driving these young people to leave a country that was aspiring for democracy and economic development in an open fashion to fight in Syria? And this is not limited to Tunisia. I'm not focusing, but this is something we've seen. What drives young men to join AQIM or NGIM or some of these other regional organizations that are there? It's desperation, it's disillusionment, it's disaffection. They don't see an opportunity within the current structures. And, providing those services to those folks, giving them opportunities, to me, is perhaps the most important thing that we can do to staunch this wave of violence that seems to be taking up good chunks of the continent. Now, there's a sense of urgency here, I have to tell you. I mean, the situation is grim in certain parts. I mean, you look at what's happening in parts of Burkina Faso. 330,000 children aren't in school as a result of the violence that's been perpetrated there. You have the Dogon and the Fulani who are being weaponized by various terrorist groups in regional fights. You have ethnic tensions looming and being, these challenges that are there, this violence is being fed and is feeding these extremist organizations to expand. And the governments need to be there to counter it. But you don't do it through force. You have to do it through providing alternatives, looking at what can make a local community, a local village, allergic to extremist ideology, allergic to some of these interventions from certain ethnic leaders who are looking to take the fight to a pointless effort. And, a lot of our attention has been on looking at state security. And I think that's, the idea was, we improve the capabilities of the military and the state, and voila, you have security for citizens. Well, most militaries protect regimes. They don't necessarily protect civilians. And so we need to look at that a bit differently. Look at citizen security. When you take polls of Africans to say what is their concern of security, terrorism isn't on the top of the list. It's being able to allow their child to go to school unmolested. It's being able to let their husband go to work without having to pay a bribe. It's allowing the wife to go collect water without being assaulted. I mean, these are the things that are on the forefront of many Africans. And so how do we address that? It's governance. It's giving people the opportunity, giving them the voice, making governments accountable to the needs and of their citizens. And The sense of urgency is growing because of these inexorable things that are hitting the continent right now. I mean, demography, the issue of demographics, of population, of migration, urbanization, youth bulge. I mean, this is hitting the continent in a big way. By 2050, there'll be over 2 billion people on the continent. Most of them will be under the age of 25. Most of them will be moving into cities. Most of them will be women. And what are they going to do? Okay, I mean, right now, according to the African Development Bank, Africa has a infrastructure finance gap of $179 billion, an annual finance gap of $179 billion. So in 10 years, you're talking about $2 trillion. All right? Where's that money coming from? It's not coming from China, whatever you want to say. I mean, and God bless the Chinese for investing in infrastructure like roads and railroads and ports. Africa can use that. But, it's global supply chain networks. How do you plug into that? We talk about women entrepreneurship. That's great. Let's support it. But what about the pipeline for future women entrepreneurs? How are they to be educated? What's the quality of that education? And we're not talking about reading, writing, and arithmetic. We're talking about being prepared for an economy of the 21st century where you have to, coding is just going to be as important. They're going to need as many electricians and electronic technicians as they are going to need engineers. Where's that coming from? To me, the funny thing is that the solutions for Africa's security are not in the military security assistance wheelhouse. But if we are to be looking at the problem in a holistic fashion, we need to break down the stovepipes that exist among donors and among various governments. This is a development issue. This is a security issue. Girls' education, to me, is one of the most important areas for any investment to be made on the continent. Yes, there's a lot of demands for a lot of different investments in a lot of different areas. Municipal planning, water, addressing the mitigation of climate change, which is inexorable impact on the cities, water shortages, that kind of thing. There's a lot of things to put your money if you're a donor or a government, but you can't put it everywhere, right? So you're going to have to make choices. And what are those choices? To me, as economists, we've seen that you invest in girls' education, it has a manifold impact on economic growth that is inclusive, right? The way out of this is by engendering prosperity and having people own that process of developing wealth, okay? And having government provide the resources to foster that. So we also know that gender inequality generates violence. There's been studies that have come out to prove this. Well, let's get to it. Let's look at that issue and let's see what we can do. You can't ignore 50% of your population and expect to grow in terms of economically, socially, peacefully. So, to me, the greatest security challenge on the continent is one of governance and the investments in what I would consider the soft side of things. And those soft investments need to be looked at as a security issue. So girls' education not only raises economic wealth and provides opportunity for young girls, but it also is a critical element into sustainable investments for security. And that's something we have to look at. Okay.
Thank you very much for that really good backdrop and survey of what insecurity looks like across the continent writ large. Now, we know there are going to be differences across different countries, but what you've described, I think, are the general trajectories and trends of the key issues that are confronting the continent today in terms of security. But I also thought one of the key points that you raised was how you define security matters, there's too much of a heavy focus on defining security in hard terms, that we need to bring in the softer elements of security to get a more comprehensive definition, and therefore then when you look at security more holistically, that way that you're able to invest in the right places. So thank you very much for that. Chantal, let me turn to you. You've been working in this space of women, peace, and security for decades now. What do you see as the connections between women, peace, and security, and where do you see continued gaps in the security conversations, whether just in general terms, in scholastic terms, or in policy terms, as far as those connections are concerned?
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here on the panel with my esteemed panelist. Maybe I go back to sort of the title of this panel, which is the role of women in peace and security. Actually, the international community has officially and formally recognized the important role of women in peace and security some 19 years ago, when in 2000 the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 1325 and launched what is now commonly known as the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, or the WPS Agenda. And I don't know how familiar you are with this WPS agenda, but I would say that this agenda is basically about two things. I think it's about the recognition, as Phil said, that gender inequality produces instability, insecurity, violent extremism. And it is about the recognition that sustainable and durable peace requires the participation of everybody in society, including women. So since 2000, the UN Security Council adopted 8 more resolutions that recognized, one, the importance of the participation of women in all decision-making processes that have to do with peace and security. And second, the importance of protection from conflict-related sexual violence. The recognition that rape as a weapon of war or as a tactic of war is a crime, a war crime, and a crime against humanity. But in the essence, the WPS agenda is really about gender equality and the importance of inclusion and participation of all in these peace and security processes. It's also about the importance of having a gender perspective when we look at international security issues or national security issues. Gender perspective allows to see how structures of gender inequality impede access and opportunities for certain people, impede well-being for certain people, and ultimately impedes peace. And I would argue that a gender perspective will also show and illuminate other inequalities that exist in society that have to do with race, ethnic background, age, etc. So I think when we apply a gender perspective to these security issues, they also eliminate, I think, other inequalities. Now, if we look at how does the WPS agenda look like in Africa? And again, Esmond has reminded us before we started this panel, Africa is a huge continent, very different countries, and we see even variation within countries. That said, on the plus side, I think the WPS agenda in Africa, first we have to think about the fact that Africa has actually a very strong, diverse and vibrant civil society. It has many activist women groups. And I would argue that the WPS agenda launched in 2000 by the Security Council would not have seen the day of light without women activists from Africa. I think we all know the efforts of women in Liberia. Lema Bowe, who received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2011 for her efforts in forcing men to negotiate peace and listen to the women, efforts that have been very well documented in the film of Abigail Disney in Pray the Devil Back to Hell. Women activists in Burundi, Rwanda, Nigeria, the DRC are making a difference in the lives of people, in the lives of women on the ground every day. The second sort of issue on the plus side of when we're looking at the role of women in peace and security on the African continent is that, first of all, almost all countries on the African continent have ratified the Convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, the CEDAW Convention. More than half have ratified the AU Protocol on the Rights of Women in Africa. The African continent has actually produced very strong, very ambitious documents that recognize the importance of gender equality, that recognize the mainstreaming of gender perspectives when we talk about security and foreign policies. The African Union Agenda of 2063, adopted in 2015, recognizes the importance of gender equality and the elimination of gender disparities and gender discrimination as critical for a prosperous, peaceful, and secure Africa. It makes the commitment of full gender parity, with women occupying at least 50% of elected public offices at all levels and half of managerial positions in both the public and private sectors. There is the Africa Peace and Security Architecture, the APSA roadmap. There is the implementation plan of the WPS Africa. Both are extremely ambitious programs. Close to 50% of AU member states, 24 to be exact, have elaborated 1325 national action plans. So national action plans to implement this UN Security Council resolution of 2000. So I think all that is actually progress, is quite good. And I think the African continent is actually far beyond other continents in the world. That said, implementation of all these plans remains problematic. Of the 24 national action plans on 1325 on the WPS agenda, only 14 are still active, 10 have lapsed. 2 weeks ago, the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security, together with PRIO, published the 2019 WPS Index, an index that measures women's autonomy and empowerment both at home, in their communities, and in society at large, along three main axes. First, along the axis of economic, social, and political inclusion. Second, in terms of justice, are there formal laws? What is the level of informal discrimination? And then thirdly, in terms of security, both, again, in the home, in terms of intimate partner violence, in terms of the community, whether it's safe to navigate within your community, and then in terms of organized violence or internal conflict war. Now, this WPS index lists the Middle East and North Africa as performing poorly on all of those three axes. The index ranks 167 countries, and only 5 African countries score in the top half, score above the global average. Namibia ranks as the best with number 62, followed by Rwanda, number 65, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Ghana, who is on 78th place. And what is kind of interesting, and then most of the African countries actually list in the bottom half below the global average. And then at the bottom you have South Sudan, the DRC, CAR, Mali, Libya, Sudan, Chad, etc. What is interesting, though, is to see that whether countries have a national action plan on 1325 and where they list on this WPS index, there's actually hardly any correlation between the two. So that goes to show that the implementation problem is really very important. I think in that sense, Africa is actually not very special. I think we see this all over in the world, whether it's in Europe, in Asia, or in Latin America, or in North America. A lot of politicians are very good in talking the talk, but not very good in walking the walk. So we have lofty policy goals, but then implementation is really lacking. Most governments do not integrate gender perspectives in their policies, whether it's in Africa, Europe, the US, or Asia. Violence against women continues unabated, whether this is conflict-related sexual violence, violence against women running for public office, and it's a big problem in Africa as well, but not just in Africa, and then intimate partner violence, which is also a worldwide problem. So I think maybe to round this off, the challenges to gender equality and progress on this agenda are many. And they differ maybe from one issue area to another. They may manifest themselves from one country to another, from one region to another. They may manifest themselves differently over time. But from the research that we have done, what is striking are actually the similarities across continents, across countries, and across issue areas. And very briefly, I would like to single out 5 challenges. First is the patriarchy. You know, the vast majority of societies and institutions have been created and structured as patriarchies, male-dominated, male-run entities that seek to perpetuate gender hierarchies whereby men should and are in charge. Second, there is the passive and or active, including, I would say, sometimes violent, resistance to change. Belief systems of groups, of individuals are hard to change, and organizations are also hard to change. And change often provokes backlash and resistance. And we see that with this agenda as well. Third, there are misconceptions or ignorance about gender. Most policymakers, including members of the NGO community, actually ignore or do not really understand what gender means and the role of gender in security affairs. And many believe that when you say gender, you actually say women, and not realizing that man, and Phil also has a gender.
Thank you.
And then gender perspectives are seen as, you know, we just have to increase the numbers of women and then we're done. It's what we call, you know, add women and stir. But that is, of course, not a gender perspective. Fourth is money. The WPS agenda, the gender equality agenda are notoriously underfunded. And then fifth is data. We continue to lack good sex disaggregated data, and so our policies are also not based on actually real knowledge. So that's as far as the challenges. I think there's some good news, but maybe we'll come to that afterwards.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I appreciated the comments that drew on both the positives but also the challenges and comparing what's going on in Africa with what's happening in other parts of the world. I think I was happy to hear your acknowledgement of some of the more activist women on the continent and the progress that they, and men, my father is one of the biggest feminists I know, that the progress that they continue to make in terms of bringing the WPS to life. I was also gratified to hear your acknowledgement of the very strong normative framework that Africa has around the WPS agenda. This is something that is often overlooked. And I think it's unfortunate when we do that. So thank you for acknowledging that. But the key issue, as you rightly pointed out, is the domestication of those commitments that African countries have made, that the domestication of this framework is sorely lacking in so many countries. And so the issue is what can we do to bring about that domestication at a faster rate? I also learned something new, which I thought was really interesting. You mentioned 5 countries in the Georgetown Index. What is striking to me, and I wonder if this also provides an opportunity for a potential solution or entry point to a solution, what was striking to me is that of those 5 countries, Namibia, Rwanda, South Africa, and Zimbabwe, these are all countries that had a conflict. The only one that's not in that conflict zone is Ghana. And I wonder what it is about conflict that makes you appreciate women differently.
Yeah, but the ones on the bottom also have conflict, so I think that's not really...
It's not, you don't see a correlation there. Interesting. All right, so that's a really good point. And then your point about use of the gender lens and how we look at security and all of our investment in various sectors. I'm hoping that is something we're going to come back to, because I think that is crucially important. Let me turn to you, Elizabeth. So Ambassador Carter touched on rapid population growth as a security concern in Africa. So given your research on political demography, how do you see the current population trends and trajectories impacting regional security and stability?
Great question, and thanks very much to the Wilson Center for having me. I think it's important to note how much Africa really stands apart from the rest of the world demographically. So in less than 10 years, half of the world's population is going to live in countries where women have on average about 2 children per woman or less, which means that while most of the world is moving towards a situation of stable population growth, or in some cases even population aging, Africa is not. On average, women in the continent have 4.6 children over the course of their lifetime. So for those of you who managed to pick up one of my handouts, the first graphic that you see there is a map of Africa's age structure trends. And what this map does is it compares the projected ratio of the population under the age of 15 in 2050 compared to today. And the 2 darkest green categories on that map are countries that are likely to have twice as many young people under the age of 15 or even more in 2050 compared to today. These are countries that already have very young age structures and that will remain persistent. Now, of course, in many ways, a youthful population is a good thing. Young people bring dynamism and energy and hold tremendous potential. But when your age structure, your population profile is this young, it can be very hard for governments to keep up, for labor markets to generate enough jobs for the increasing numbers of people who are seeking employment every year, and equally challenging to provide adequate health care and education to improve these young people's well-being. And as Ambassador Carter alluded to, that can create a situation where young people feel desperate, legitimately so. Feel grievances against the government for the lack of opportunities that are available to them. And in turn, some of them can become more vulnerable to extremism or even to violence and conflict. I also do want to make note, as Mande has helpfully reminded us, that Africa is less and less homogeneous, and that's true from a demographic perspective. So as you can see on that map, Northern and Southern Africa are already in a much better place demographically. They have fertility rates that are very close to the global average of about 2.5 children per woman. And there's been recent progress elsewhere on the continent too, in West and East and Central Africa. So 2 real linchpins in their regions, Ghana and Kenya, have both seen very dramatic improvements in family planning and changes in fertility recently. Both of those 2 countries have fertility rates of under 4 children per woman. So why does this matter? Well, the truth is that population trends affect many sectors, including peace and security, in both positive and negative ways. So first, the ways that are not such good news. Some statistical analysis conducted by my colleague Richard Sincata, looking at over 100 countries' experiences over the past 40 years, has found that countries with very young age structures are almost impossibly likely to achieve high levels of development across multiple sectors. It almost never happens. So, for example, if you look at a country like Nigeria, that's a country that has a median age of 18. That means that half of the country's population is younger than 18. And the reason for that is that the fertility rate there, the number of children per woman, is over 5. That kind of a country has only a 1% chance of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals target for child health, for child mortality. The second graph on the handout shows the probability of countries experiencing internal conflict, a specific type of civil conflict that we call revolutionary, where there are armed groups trying to overthrow the government. And if a country has recently had a history of that type of conflict, which many in this region have, and they have a youthful population with a median age under 20, then they are 75% likely to continue experiencing that type of revolutionary conflict in the coming years. But if their age structure is different, if it's more balanced and more mature, even with a recent history of conflict, their probability of future conflict drops dramatically. Now, there is good news to all of this. It's not just gloom and doom, and that is that once mortality and fertility rates fall, and countries reach a median age of about 25 or 26, so half of their population is under 25 or 26, then a real demographic window of opportunity opens for them. And many of you are probably familiar with the concept of the demographic dividend. It was the focus of an earlier event in this series. And that is the acceleration in economic growth that becomes possible, but not guaranteed, once countries' fertility rates fall and a much larger proportion of their population is comprised of working age adults relative to dependent children. What's important that you all know, though, is that dividends from demographic change are not just economic. They expand across multiple sectors. And I'll give you 4 examples. So once a country's median age reaches 26, then it's more likely than not to have a secondary school enrollment rate above 60%. Once the median age reaches 27, then it is more likely than not to be free from revolutionary conflict for at least the next 5 years, even with a history of recent conflict. Once the median age reaches 29, then a country is more likely than not to attain that Sustainable Development Goals target for child health that I mentioned. And finally, as you can see on the third graph on the handout, once a country's median age reaches 31, it is more likely than not to be rated as an upper middle income country. So we find that countries with youthful age structures don't have too much difficulty transitioning economically from being a low income country to a lower middle income country, but that transition to upper middle income status, where you have per capita incomes of around $4,000, doesn't really happen until they have advanced significantly through the demographic transition. And the last little demographic tidbit I would share with you is that no country has reached that demographic window of opportunity until its fertility rate has fallen below 3 children per woman.
Wow. Okay.
Wow.
No, this is really just fascinating, and so thank you for sharing that. I like and I am fascinated by and would like to get more into the information that you just provided, really directly linking in a data-based way, which is what you do, development and peace and stability to demography, the demographic trajectory. I think that is fascinating. And I think one of the things that comes to mind right now is how do you bring what you just shared with us into a policy environment so this information can be better articulated with policy and strategies that various countries undertake, because this is difficult to argue against. I mean, it was, in general, I knew what you were talking about, but to see it so clearly in terms of the numbers is just fascinating to me, and I think has great policy import. So thank you so much for sharing that. Always a good benefit when, as a moderator, you learn new things. So fantastic. Let me now turn to you, Dr. Eze. Alex, you just returned to the United States after nearly 20 years in Nairobi as the founder and executive director of the African Population and Health Center. You've long been a leader in population health, education, and development issues in the region. So from your perspective, that practical on-the-ground perspective, having lived in Africa for so long and worked on the continent for so long, what is missing from the conversation about security? And is there a correlation and connection between security and development in the region?
Thank you, Monday, and thank you for having me on this panel. I think you've heard a lot this morning about some of the major challenges that exist in Africa today, whether it is related to governance or to population, and, gender, all of those. And I think it's no problem you look for and you will not be able to find somehow on the continent. But there are certain things that are often missing from these conversations. I think just as I get into those, think about the issue of the population that Liz has mentioned and narrated. To think about the population of Africa doubling, say, over the next 30 years, it means that almost everything that we have in Africa today, we have to double them. Think about schools, teachers, hospitals, doctors, nurses, roads, houses, jobs. I can go on. In the next 30 years, in order to maintain the current levels of inadequate coverage of services, of amenities, of infrastructure, we've heard about the $178 billion gap in investments for infrastructure that the African Development Bank tells us every single year. So it's a real challenge as we think about the continent and things like that. But why are we there? I think some of the conversations that we have not, or some of the things that do not come into the conversations that we have on Africa, is really, some of them will be historical. And we are not comfortable talking about some of those relationships because we say, oh, get over it. You know, colonial relationships happened. But it's not just the colonial relationship that is important. I think if you look at the countries in the Sahel that has a lot of the worst outcomes that we look at, including those in Central Africa, most of these countries are actually former French colonies. And with the post-colonial compact they have in these countries, it became almost impossible for any of the governments within that region to make the necessary type of investments that are needed in human capital. If you have to invest 85% of your nation resources and deposit it in a bank in France, in Paris, that you have to borrow against, what can you work with? Even up to today, more than 50 years after independence, they are still required to deposit 65% of their foreign exchanges with the French central bank. We don't talk about it. But I think that is core to the inability of many countries to make the necessary investments in human capital. And we know that those investments also have benefits in changing population growth rates and trajectories on the continent. So these things are all connected, and we do not talk about them. But the other point that we really do not talk about much is the role of institutions and local institutions. We are interested in identifying the solutions that Africa needs. And I do remember the Minister of Education in South Sudan once saying, because South Sudan is in need, everybody gives us solutions that we do not need. So we sit in Washington, in Paris, in London, and we think about what Africa needs. And there's very little evidence coming from the continent, from people on the continent, sitting down with those problems, living with those problems, contributing to those ideas that could actually transform the continent. And we have, because the model that we have for development actually is dealing with emergencies and humanitarian crises. And it doesn't matter what global organization you're talking about. They all have a foundation in emergency response and crisis. So we really do not understand development and what it is. Building strong local institutions is almost indispensable. We cannot make much progress until you talked about governance, Phil.
Mm-hmm.
How do you actually hold governments accountable from outside?
Okay.
You can't. And it requires developing institutions on the continent. Look at the universities in Africa. How are they rated? I mean, I was talking to some people saying, look, what if we can invest $1 billion a year over the next 10 years to local institutions with no strings attached to help them develop the type of processes and systems and human resources they need to advance the types of ideas and agendas they feel could be transformative for Africa? I think, where is that going to come from? Well, the current inefficiencies that exist in our development process and strategies through subcontracting agreements and different models that we currently implement can release 10 times that amount to support institutions. The ideas that will change Africa tomorrow and today are sitting with Africans in Africa. And until we begin to recognize those, and that speaks to the soft side investments you talked about, that's where actually the opportunities are. And one last point on that. When we have such institutions and organizations, currently, part of the work I'm doing suggests that we can think about in Africa, there are so many organizations. You go to every community, there are too many NGOs, CBOs, and things like that. But how many of them actually can run a $100,000 budget, or 10 million budget, no, 1 million budget? So to think of an African organization, when we think of investing in Africa, we think of in tens of thousands, not in tens of millions. And so that creates this perpetual dependence and capacity gap that exists. And that's one major constraint. The African Development Bank talks about it. They can mobilize the resources, but you cannot be able to spend it. And how do you do that? How do you build that capacity on the continent? And my sense is that we really need to change the models of engagement by recognizing the role that African institutions could play and should play within this. So from the ground, and having lived in India, I do feel there are huge opportunities for us to really make a difference for what is there. But it will require challenging the current strategies of engagement with Africa. What we think are important, what we think they need versus what truly is needed on the continent. And I can go back to that later. But to me, that's where the real challenge is. And it does not, it's not something that many people recognize because it challenges the current global infrastructure and establishments of how we work. But if we cannot do that, we've done this. I can tell you, it doesn't matter. You are educated in some of the best institutions here. You go back to Africa. Somebody is coming there with a master's degree. They're coming to build your capacity. When we think of partnerships with Africa, we're going to help them. When we think of Europe, we want to partner with them. We want to sit on the table and think about engagements and things like that. So it's a whole mindset that needs to change if we are going to make a difference in the way we engage with Africa to address some of these real challenges that are on the ground.
I am loving this panel. Just absolutely loving it. Look, what you've really given us here is you're challenging us to look at the foreign dimension of the governance issue that Phil raised. That the governance issue is not just, we shouldn't just look at Africa, but it's much more global than that. That international and foreign governance is also an aspect of where Africa is today and where Africa could go. So that's one piece of it. In particular, you've raised the issue of the lingering impacts of colonialism and the different manifestation of those relationships and how they continue to hamper progress on some of the issues that we're talking about today. And so you're raising some really difficult issues that we need to look at as part of the broader engagement in terms of how we do things and where we go from here. You've also challenged us on a development model that is not comprehensive enough, that takes agency away from Africans, that to some extent, and I have argued this before, you didn't use this word, but I will use it in certain instances where I have actually seen that engagement. I think the engagement models that denigrate what Africans bring to the process, and you will not have a sustainable peace until you learn to respect the knowledge, the agency that Africans bring to the process. You can't create security for Africans. They have to own it and create it themselves, and all you do is bring added value. And so I think that's an important issue that we do need to talk about. Let me, I don't want to go on and on. This is a fascinating panel. I think I have one more question for you because I really want to bring the audience in. Let me turn to a last question for you, Elizabeth, just to talk to us a little bit more about your research and the types of policy interventions that you think would promote a more balanced age structure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I will give 3 examples, and they are all centered on women, which is one of our focus areas today. So I will start with the big one, which has a very dramatic impact and direct impact on fertility rates, and that is expanding access to and use of voluntary family planning. So there is a direct relationship between increases in contraceptive use according to women's wishes, and declines in the fertility rate. For every 13 percentage point increase in contraceptive use, the fertility rate will fall by about 1 child per woman. And this is an important issue because currently more than 1/5 of women in sub-Saharan Africa have what's called an unmet need for family planning. And that means that they have expressed a preference to either avoid having more children or to postpone their next pregnancy, but they are not using an effective method of family planning. So providing these services to meet women's stated preferences and needs is a really key first step. But women's empowerment goes beyond that. And so the second area that I would urge us to focus on is women's education. And that's because, first of all, women's education has a direct relationship with fertility as well. In fact, it's bidirectional, and it can be a little bit difficult to tease out the causality. But we do know that expanding women's education delays early childbearing and delays early marriage. So there was a study, for example, in Ethiopia a few years ago that found that for each additional year of girls' education, the probability of their beginning childbearing and of getting married declined by 6 to 7 percentage points, and that's just per single year of education. Education is something that has really wide-ranging benefits for women, for their families, and also for societies. So it expands that human capital and potential that we talked about. And the third area that I would urge us to focus on is really enabling women to build the skills that allow them to become drivers of economic growth. So we'll hear a lot in some of these discussions about how, expanding access to family planning or education allows women to get jobs and earn income. It's not that simple. So in most of these countries, except for a few where it's really culturally prescribed, women are economically active. They are earning income. There is no choice in the matter. It just happens often to be in very low income situations, subsistence agriculture, small scale trading, things that don't really provide them and their families with, the mechanisms to build a better life. So what I would urge us to focus on is more the skills generation, education, training that enable women to transition into the formal labor force, to obtain wage-paying jobs that provide them much better economic security. And if we do these three things and many others, we can not only enhance women's well-being, but also promote the national development and the economic growth and the peace and stability that we're here to talk about today.
Thank you. All right. Just a really fantastic panel for us this morning. So we have about 30 minutes. Oh, no. How much time do we have? We have an hour. Fantastic. So here's what we're going to do. I will take 3 questions at a time. If you want to ask a question or make a comment, raise your hand, and we'll bring a mic over to you. And please identify yourself by name and your institutional affiliation, if any, and the speaker to whom you're directing your question, and then we'll take the 3, and then we'll go from there. All right, so the floor is open. I'll start with the gentleman over here.
Yeah, hi, I'm Paul Vincelli, Jefferson Science Fellow, and this is directed to Alex. If I understood correctly, you were saying that in 30 years services must double in the African continent, and so I'm wondering how that relates to projections for food production on the continent and foreign trade and food security in general.
All right. Then the lady in the red shirt back there, maroon shirt, can't really see.
Hi, thank you so much to our panelists. My name is Carrie Dobies, and I work as a Senior Technical Program Manager at IMA World Health, mainly managing USAID and DFID-funded projects. My question is also for Alex. Thank you so much for your perspective about specifically bringing up the idea of models that have no strings attached or fewer strings attached in terms of development assistance. I guess my question is if knowing that so much of the assistance, at least coming from the U.S., comes through the USAID funding mechanism, which is allocated by Congress years in advance, how would you suggest, or how do you envision that moving forward, kind of mitigating those different systems, and specifically, trying to orient money that would go towards assistance with more of like sort of open-ended possibilities for how the money can be spent versus the way that money is currently allocated today in the U.S. and also through a lot of other donor countries.
All right, we'll take one more. I'll take the gentleman up here, and I'll take you in the next round. I see you. Mm-hmm.
Mark Stuckert, formerly with Commerce and OPIC. Thank you for the Wilson Center for a great panel again today. Question, U.S. government policy in terms of population has been, I don't know what the right word is, constipated, because we have a group of folks who don't believe in birth control, and there are a group of folks who understand all of the dynamics and problems that a huge expansion of population creates. A few years back, all of the USAID folks who had been in charge of this area, both Republicans and Democrats, had asked for much more funding for this area because it touches on so many things: security, refugees, migration, climate change, development. It's extraordinary that this is the key to so many things. How do you see that progressing in the future? Thank you.
All right, so 3 very good questions. Alex, you were put on the 2 are directed at you, the doubling of requirements and how projections for food production and food security look like based on your initial opening remark. And then the second question on how U.S. engagement can be better structured to avoid some of the challenges that you pointed out in terms of conditionalities and how those conditionalities sometimes don't help. And then the third question I think I'll open up to all of you. Anybody who wants to take that question is really U.S. government policy on population and how you see that moving forward based on the discussion that we just had here. So Alex, let me start with you and then I'll just bring it in.
Okay, thank you, Monday. Maybe before I get into that, I just wanted to add one other point, the 3 points Elizabeth mentioned at the end of her input last time, which is really the low-hanging fruit in trying to address this population question in Africa is actually child marriage and early age at first birth. If we can delay that by 2 years, we can actually reduce projected population growth by 10%. And this is such a, and it will have just direct effect because of the impact it has on intergenerational gap between mothers and daughters and things like that. But beyond that, if girls marry later, they are more likely to benefit from educational opportunities, job opportunities, and many other things that use family planning more. And so there are the indirect effects. And if we're really going to do this, I think these are some of those low-hanging fruits that we can really achieve a whole lot more with if there are policies that are implemented to change that across the continent. With respect to food security, for the African Development Bank, that's one of their high fives, Feed Africa. And as we know, currently, Africa has lost out in the Green Revolution, and they are trying to do a catch-up, and for many different reasons. We've been able to increase food production by expanding the land area we cultivate, and that has led to many challenges, including loss of tropical rainforest in most of West Africa and all of that. And we cannot continue that way. Actually, food importation has become is part of the daily routine for many people. So what are the prospects? And the thing is this, with food production is, I think there's quite a lot that can be done, and there's a lot that's already being done with technology to improve agricultural yield per acre, which is an area that progress could be made. But the challenge we have is that if you look at, and I take Nigeria for example, and you look at the fact that maybe I would say 80% of the food production is still subsistence in very small holder farms. And it becomes very difficult to actually achieve the levels of mechanization and inputs that you need to scale up those productions. So we need to change the whole model. And part of what has been done in Nigeria and the African Development Bank is supporting is to encourage younger people to come into agriculture, maybe create better cooperatives, like they've seen that in some different sectors in Kenya, for instance, in tea, coffee, and things like that. But to move beyond the cash crops to food production, and I think there is a huge opportunity there. But the truth of the matter is the growth of the population will put pressure and continue to put pressure on that. And with urbanization, which is also changing the population dynamics in rural areas that do much of the food production, the production of the food in Africa, that creates further challenges as well. So my take on that is that that's an area where innovation is needed, but it will be a major challenge for the continent as we go forward. With respect to how can we manage the current types of funding constraints that exist, say, with USAID funding and all those. The position we are taking through this is we need to get Africa and African countries to actually own the process of thinking about institutions on the continent. And particularly, I'm interested in research institutions, including universities and think tanks and all of those. And if they can come together to create a basket funding where they all contribute as individual countries to such a basket, and then ask partners to support them to improve the level of resources that's available. And then they can use that type of resource to make calls that are more open, like we say, how do we improve food security in Africa? It could deal with agricultural inputs and production. It could deal with post-harvest food, post-harvest management of food and all that. So different types and elements of those could come in. But it's broad enough to allow people to actually reflect on what the issues are in their various countries and settings and how can they actually bring innovative solutions to those problems. What is happening now is we define the priorities that we want to fund, and people have to fit their ideas and agendas within those defined areas. And so it doesn't matter what you're thinking the solutions are. If it doesn't fit the currently defined priority of the funding, you don't get funded. So it creates a disconnect between what people on the ground actually feel needs to be done. I can tell you, in my 19 years at APHRC, a lot of the ideas we felt were things that will have the most impact, particularly, say, in slums, were never funded. Or you might think, okay, this is an integrated program that involved behavior change and infrastructure and different other things. And somebody comes and says, I'm interested in the toilets. And you can get small money to do that. And then the other year, I'm interested in that. So at the end of the day, your coherent program that could be implemented becomes balkanized into very small, tiny little pieces that at the end they don't add up. So the current model, that's what we want to see. How do you change that? How do you create this system that will allow for people to bring their own ideas and creativity to the questions they're asking and the solutions they are bringing to the table?
Can I just, before I move to Elizabeth, I thought that the question on the food security was really important. And I don't know if you, Alex, or anybody else on the panel, maybe Phil would like to add to that, because I know you have an interest in that too, Phil. But for me, I don't know enough about the subject, except to say another dimension of that needs to be looked at has to be land policy in many African countries. That's a huge, huge issue of concern in so many countries that I think, as I look over the horizon and I see the lack of land policy or the discombobulated land policy that you have even within countries as really coming to the forefront and impacting the issue of food security that we are talking about. So Phil, I don't know if you want to add on that food security thing, and then I'll come back to you, Elizabeth, and come to Chantal.
I think when you look at the question of food security, you're not talking about food self-sufficiency, right? You're talking about, it's a much more complicated structure. The idea that Africa will be able to produce food to feed all Africans is a mistaken approach. What has to happen is that Africa needs to get itself better plugged into the global supply chain networks and improve distribution systems within the continent and externally so that food can be delivered and provided to where it is needed through effective distribution systems, through groceries or whatever the case may be, grocery systems or whatever. That's important to look at. The other thing is Manda, you touched on it. The issue, it's land tenure issues. Yeah. And this ties to the fact that, you're getting smallholder plots getting smaller and smaller as the families pass this to other children. And that's not sustainable. I mean, subsistence farming is not the path for economic prosperity, right? And so the idea of developing more effective cooperatives or corporate type of approaches to farming is really a path that lends to greater wealth generation, increased productivity, but also plugging into these global supply chains that are necessary. I mean, you look at, a lot of the exports that come out of Africa, bananas and cashews and cocoa and tea and coffee. These are for cash crops that are going out there. But that cash, if you go back to basic economics, comparative advantage, right? I mean, you're producing something that lends itself to a need that you can accommodate through trade. So plugging into that, Africa's percentage of African trade on the global market has been historically pathetic. It's like 3%, right? I mean, and it hasn't changed for decades. That has to change. And food security is directly related to that. It's directly related to the legal structure so that people can actually own the land that they're going to be using. I mean, this goes back to Hernando de Soto's idea of having an asset that you can build upon. A lot of land isn't owned by the farmers who till it, right? I mean, it's customary, it's held, and there's confusion. as to who owns that land. And so I think those are things that have to be addressed. These are not new things. Listen, I've been working on Africa for buku años, right? And you know, when I started working on this stuff back in the 80s, these were the issues we were talking about. And I come back to Alex's point, you know, the Africans have to own this. And there's, by the way, there's no such thing as no strings attached aid, okay?
Says the policymaker
there's
from
always strings
ages,
attached,
yeah, all right.
okay? The question is whose strings, right? And in my view, and I've been at the table, I've been at the negotiations where you try, and I've seen it, where the African stakeholders, where they are directly involved in the formulation of their development strategies, when they're directly involved in the discussion of their programming, the programs and the aid assistance is far more effective. And that more and more needs to happen. But you know, it is naive to think that donors are going to write blank checks because we have taxpayers to respond to, right? And to deal with that. But at the same time, we have also seen historically that growth is generated through domestic investment, through domestic resources. And that has to be marshaled even greater within the context of Africa. So I think I look at that in that context.
All right, we could have this back and forth
No.
between the two of you right now because I saw Alex's face go, huh? But let me move it over to Elizabeth. If you want to comment on any of the questions that we were asked.
Sure. So I'll take the third question about U.S. government population policy. You are absolutely correct that there are certain policy requirements that come in and out of play or even get expanded depending on the administration. But what has not changed is that USAID remains the largest single donor of family planning assistance in the international arena. And for that, we largely have to thank Congress and what has historically been a bipartisan commitment to family planning. And that has remained steady. It certainly does need to grow, as you pointed out, I think for the call for $1 billion in family planning funds that came out a few years ago. But at the least, it is not shrinking. And what is surprisingly effective, regardless of the audience and their sort of political view, when you're talking about population programs, is to do what we're doing today and to link them to multisectoral development. So people who are interested in reducing the need for military assistance, for kinetic force elsewhere, are very struck by the findings that, you know, population is something that directly influences vulnerability to civil conflict, to peace and stability, to economic growth. So making these linkages that we're doing can be extremely effective, sort of beyond the political realm. And I would encourage us to continue to do that.
I have to echo that because my work with the Population Institute, you know, going up and talking, there is bipartisan support for addressing some of these issues. Yes, there's some touchy aspects of it, but you know that's what politics is all about, right? But I think what's been really intriguing is exactly what Liz is talking about, where you're knocking down the stovepipes, where you know family planning is a development issue that's limited. No. If you start looking at it more broadly as a security issue, as a growth issue, as a development issue, as a finance issue, then people start looking at it. Oh, there's a lot we can do here in a positive way that has manifold results, and there's a growing appreciation of that. I mean, taxpayers' dollars, the more you can leverage it for good things, the better it's used, right? And I think that is an argument that is gaining some, excuse upon, currency on the Hill.
Chantal?
Yeah, I think, you know, at the heart, all these problems are really political problems, and they're really about power. And we should not forget about that. Women have a hard time getting into the formal economic sector. Why is that? Alex talks a lot about institutions. Well, who sits or who rules those institutions? Who runs those institutions? Women who are trying to run for political office are being subjected to violence, physical violence, sexual violence. You know, unless we give women equal power to men, we're not going to change any of this. But since this is a political problem, we're also being faced with a lot of resistance to this because, you know, men don't really want to give up that power. even if ultimately on the long term everybody would benefit by this. The demographic issue, Elizabeth, has said it's really important when women have power over their own reproductive health. Why is it that they don't have that right now? Governance issues. Who is sitting on top of these governance structures? Take an example. So Rwanda is a very good example in terms of having a lot of women parliamentarians. But in Rwanda, is political power really situated in parliament, yes or no? So I think it is really imperative that we look at this as political problems and not just technical problems that can be solved by doing development aid in a slightly different way, and realizing that within the societies that we're working on, people sit at different levels, have different interests. And if we really want to include everybody, that means that our power structures have to change. And that is true, I think, in Africa, as well as in our own country here in the US, as well as in Europe.
Yeah, we could go back and forth on these issues. Thank you to all of you, but what I want to do is bring in more of the audience. Because my sister back there, I think your glasses are red, is about all I can see. All right.
All right. Good morning, and thank you. This is definitely an interesting panel, and I kind of want the panelists to be left to go back and forth. I think that'll be fascinating as well. Putting my money on Alex. Good morning, everyone. My name is Quisha Bradley. I'm with Trailblazers for Global Health, LLC. And kind of piggybacking on what Chantal just said with regards to power, takes me back to Chantal's presentation in the first half, where she discussed patriarchy as one of the challenges. And immediately I completely understood what she was talking about with that statement. It also reminds me of Alex's statement with regards to the impacts of what I would just deem neocolonialism and how it shows itself in current iterations of various things happening in the globe. But again, I'm able to recognize and I understand, okay, what does the historical context and colonial nature of certain countries have to do with current situations and statistics? But I guess with regards to power and how we change that structure, how and when do we have these difficult conversations of this is patriarchy, this is the impact it has on these industries, this is neocolonialism, this is what it has on these industries, and I guess whose role, what level, because as a project implementer and someone who's supported a CSO project, people on the ground, we get it. You know, for those of us who are helping to do from the ground up, we understand, but how do we build that? How do we kind of lessen that disconnect? We all know it exists, but I don't think there can be meaningful change or meaningful steps forward until we kind of identify the issue, who's doing it, and moving forward. So a very convoluted question, but in essence, how do we name and change and make concrete steps towards these power structures, which we know are going to take centuries to change because they've taken centuries to be built? Thank you.
All right. There's a gentleman back. I'll work my way up front. Let me take 3 questions in the back. There's a gentleman back there. That will be you, sir. Sorry.
Good morning. Todd Preston with the Glover Park Group. Thanks again to the panel for a really excellent conversation. I guess a 2-part question. One, as you survey the continent, certainly there are countries that are growing even faster than doubling in 30 years. I think of Niger and the Sahel. Could you all comment on some countries based on age structure and population growth rates that are perhaps most concerning to you over the next few decades? And then a second question, which is probably more for Ambassador Carter, in terms of this issue of stovepiping, at least within the USG. Certainly there's AID, there's the State Department. We also have the Millennium Challenge Corporation the Development Finance Corporation that's standing up. And then last but not least is the Defense Department, which we all know is far better resource than all these other agencies. I'd be particularly interested in Ambassador Carter's experience when he was at AFRICOM and how the military side of this sees these challenges and to what extent some of those resources perhaps could be tapped for the quote-unquote soft side of this equation.
Sorry, I'm just taking some notes. I'll take one last question from the back there. There's a lady way in the back over there. I will move up. I promise I'll get you all in.
Good morning. My name's Selena Hayes. I'm with Hayes Group International. My experience is primarily on the continent, but working in the military space with AFRICOM and the TSOC, SOC Africa. And I've also worked closely with USAID, so more Civ Mil. I often say the next enemy is a 15-year-old girl on Snapchat. She is essentially controlling the narrative, and it's a narrative that we fail to understand. And I think through some of the problem sets that exist. I'll also make a comment. A lot of the women, peace and security events I go to, it's mostly women. And so I always encourage my male counterparts, please attend these conferences, because I think as women, we understand the narrative and what needs to be done. But I think the other 50%, the male counterparts, need to start hearing the same dialogue. But my question actually is revolved around technology and data. So I'd like to hear from the panel what you think are some of the new technologies that could be introduced, in particular into Africa, in some of the verticals like the agricultural sector. There's some great new technology out there that I think could be implemented. And what do you think the role of data will play in the next 50 years in solving some of these problems?
All right, before I turn it over to the panel, let me just get a quick show of hands of how many more people want to engage with a question. Okay, thank you. So what I'm going to do is, because we'll have 30 minutes, I'm going to ask you all to take no more than a couple of minutes to answer whichever of the questions that you would like to respond to. The first question was about bridging the disconnect so we can get to these new power structures. What are our entry points there for getting to this new power structure that we know we all believe we need to have in order to have an impact on the issues that we're talking about? And then there was a second questions about the most concerning countries in terms of the age structure trajectories. Which of those, which countries do you think make that list? And then how we break the stove piping within the U.S. Government on this issue. You know, the DoD has so many resources, how DoD views security challenges in Africa and how we can get to a better place of sharing resources. And perhaps I would argue maybe even redefining the problem so everybody sees the equities from the different agency perspectives so we can invest in those. And then the last question was on the role of technology and data in the issues that we're talking about. So let me start with you, Chantal. I'll go to the women first and then bring it round to Alex and then Ambassador Carter. So pick a question, 2 minutes, please respond.
Thank you. So maybe I'll start with the first question. And I think, you know, the patriarchy for me is really a big part of the problem. When you look at who has been driving progress in terms of the gender equality and WPS agenda, it is, first of all and foremost, civil society, women's organization. They are really leading the charge here. And so we need to support them. I think scholarship has also contributed. I think some of the research that has come out and that has shown the relationships between gender inequality and instability and conflict is important and should be supported. International organizations have actually been quite important, particularly also for civil society organizations, in helping civil society organizations and women's organizations to organize, set up transnational and international alliances. And then, of course, norms and laws are really very important. And there, I think, actually, Africa is doing pretty well. So what should we be striving for? What kind of strategies should we have if we want to really make progress on this agenda? I think, first of all, we should stop talking about women, peace, and security. When we say women, peace, and security, the men hear women, oh, it's not important, it's marginal. I think we should really focus on gender, peace, and security, focus on these power hierarchies in society. Second, when we talk about, gender balance and numbers, numbers are important. But 30% doesn't cut it. We should really go for gender parity 50-50, and there's actually an important program here at the Wilson Center that is striving for that. I think we need to train our young analysts in how to do gender analysis and push for gender perspectives in our policy analysis. Our government should do this systematically. And we need accountability. We need to hold our governments accountable for all these lofty policy statements they are making. And we need to bring to justice those who commit crimes, sexual violence in particular. I think there are too many people who just walk away. I think if you look at the Me Too movement, you've seen how pervasive this is everywhere on the globe. And I think we really need to address this. And then lastly, I'll say it again, this is a deeply political agenda. It's going to be a tough agenda, and activists will need to be able to play offense and defense at the same time.
Thank you. Elizabeth?
So I wish I could answer all four, but
Sorry.
I understand. So just super briefly on the first question about naming and changing power and the patriarchy, I think it's important to acknowledge that some donors are taking very concrete steps in this regard. Certainly some of the private foundations, for example, are explicitly cutting back funding for U.S. and Western-based organizations in the interest of supporting local organizations. So there is some movement happening. USAID, as part of its focus on the journey to self-reliance, is also promoting partnerships with and direct funding to local organizations. It's just a first step, but there is some promise there. To the question on which countries are most concerning in terms of their aid structures, I think you called our attention, Todd, to the Sahel region. Certainly, many of the countries there have fertility rates, approaching 7 children per woman, and the population trends there are quite dramatic. I would also add, frankly, Nigeria to the list. In 2050, Nigeria's population will be larger than the United States, which in and of itself is not a problem. However, providing services and futures and opportunities for hundreds of millions of people is something that the government of Nigeria hasn't been able to do very well so far. These are also countries where 20% or less of women are using family planning, and part of that is in fact due to weaknesses in the health system. And on the technology question, there are some really interesting inroads on contraceptive technology, for example, self-administered injectable contraception, but that can be a problem to administer in countries with such weak health systems. But it's also not that simple. A lot of the rationale behind low use of family planning is tied to really deeply entrenched gender and cultural norms. We have to acknowledge that women are complex human beings, and that it is possible both to, wish to not have a pregnancy and also make a conscious choice not to use family planning for other reasons. So I just want to say it's not as simple as kind of if you build it, they will come. There are a lot of deep challenges to be faced here.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Alex?
Okay. Just very quickly on 3 of the 4 questions. On patriarchy and power structures, I'm hoping that we are not saying that Africa is where it is because of patriarchy, because some of us will argue that there are many more patriarchal societies that have made progress in Southeast Asia, for example. Japan, China, the rest of them are more patriarchal than Africa. And why have they made progress? So I think we need to be able to isolate what is really the problem we want to address. And I do accept that gender is important, and we need to address some of these issues. But it's not why we are where we are.
Can we say it's a contributing factor?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's
just checking.
Okay. Yeah, we can say that. But the point, I guess you understand what I'm trying to say.
No, I understand you.
Yeah. In terms of the countries that one would be most concerned about, I think you've mentioned a number of the Sahelian countries, Niger, Chad, Mali, where population growth rate is still at 3% or more, means that every 23 years or less, these countries are doubling. And at that rate of growth is really very difficult to sustain the investments that are needed in human capital within development. But also, you mentioned Nigeria and DR Congo and Central African Republic. Particularly Nigeria and DR Congo are 2 countries we need to pay attention to, because they are very large countries, large populations, and growing also very fast. And they are not doing very well economically. And it is projected that, I don't know how many, 60% of the poor people or ultra poor people will be in these 2 countries. So if we really want to deal with poverty in Africa, we cannot achieve or make much progress in it until we get it right in Nigeria and DR Congo. So they are critical, they are important, and they are very concerning as we think about demography in Africa. And finally, in terms of technology, the point we've continued to make is, Africa has missed out on the first 3 industrial revolutions. We are on the 4th one. And we cannot think of Africa as a consumer of technology. What is Africa's contribution to this technological innovations and growth and revolution that is going on? And how do we and we cannot get there and get our into the game unless we build and strengthen local institutions and knowledge systems on the continent, which is why the point I've made at the beginning about the role of institutions and knowledge-based systems on the continent is so critical. If otherwise, these revolutions will continue to create to keep Africa behind as we respond as consumers of technologies that are defined and developed and overseas and then imported into Africa. So we have to really rethink what is the contribution of Africa to the data revolution, to the technological revolutions and innovations and things like that. And it starts with building very strong local knowledge systems and research institutions.
Thank you. Phil.
Okay, places to worry about in terms of population. The Sahel, for sure. And that includes Nigeria. I mean, by 2050, 1 in 4 people on the planet will be an African. 1 in 10 will be a Nigerian. We need to have educated folks. We need to have people who are productive. They need to have people who are working in the formal sector. So I think those are big issues. Alex is absolutely right. Nigeria is the giant of the continent, right? I mean, its GDP is double that of South Africa's, right? And South Africa's is the size of Denmark's GDP. And, it's the most populous country in Africa. And the Congo is one of the largest and one of the most resource rich, can't say that too many times, but there's an infrastructure. You can't drive from Kinshasa to Goma, or you could, but it would take you a couple of decades because you have to build a road. So, I mean, there's some real challenges that have to happen there. As for the issue of technology and data, data would be good. There isn't any, or isn't enough to come to the decisions and come up with policies that are effective. There's tremendous data gaps. There are tremendous data gaps in Africa on the social side, on the technological side, on the commercial side. Businesses, how do you develop commercial partnerships when there's no data on the businesses in Africa, since most of them are privately owned. How do you do that? And as for the stovepiping, this is a pet peeve of mine. With the U.S. government, we have to look at greater flexibility in terms of the resources that are available within the different departments. For example, when I was there, we were looking at developing a facility in Agadez and in Niger, and we wanted to provide, we did some polling, look at the local community needs, and we wanted to provide some $13 million to USAID, which did not have an aid mission at Niger at the time, it does now, to help them deal with some of the social development needs of Agadez, where we were making a security investment. So this development assistance was going to help ensure our investment in security that was helping the Nigerians and ourselves in the war against terror. No brainer, right? Couldn't get the money across. Couldn't do it because of legislative requirements, and this was DOD money, this wasn't development money. Now, there's been some changes, I understand, in the law that allowed for up to about $75 million to be transferred from DOD to state and AID, but that hasn't been used. So we need to look at this flexibility because there is a growing awareness. At least when I was at AFRICOM, we all recognized that, yeah, we can continue doing the sharp end of things, and we have to. I mean, there's some of these governments face existential threats, and we have to work with them to deal with these bad cases, these terrorist organizations. I'm not saying stop that. But for us to be sustainable, to deal with it, we have to deal with the social issues. And there's been constant comments. Everyone who's worked in Africa in uniform, the leadership of AFRICOM, the various different commanders that have been there, the various different folks who work in the African unit in the Pentagon, both in the Joint Chiefs of Staff office as well as in the Secretary of Defense office, all say the same thing, that we need to look at other issues on the social side, but that's not in their wheelhouse. That's with state and aid. We have to go back to people like Secretary Mattis and Secretary Gates, who were some of the greatest proponents for improved monies for diplomacy and for development. Mattis was the most poignant about it. He says, if you don't give money to diplomats, you have to give me more money for bullets, essentially. And that's something we have to look at. And I think there are resources that have to be made, and we have to look at our development agenda, not just in the context of development, but also in the context of sustainable security. Because without it, you can't have security without development. You can have development without security. But for some reason, we decide to stovepipe these things into different houses, and they don't connect. They absolutely do connect, and people on the ground know that.
All right. I'll come to it. Let me just add one point to the patriarchy issue. I think one of the things that we also need to bring to the toolbox is looking at some African cultures in this context. It's not all uniform. I come from a culture where I am gendered both ways, depending on the space that I'm operating in. And I have those rights of a he or she, depending on who I'm talking to and what space I'm working in. That is a positive resource that we can bring to this whole issue. So it's not a blank slate, it's not uniform. There's some good things that work in this space that are African owned and generated and have been passed down from one generation to the next. So the question is, how do we take advantage of those institutions and processes and definitions and concepts to add value to what we're trying to achieve here? So let me take another round of questions. I'm going to limit everybody to one question, 1 minute. All right? Okay, so I'll move my way in. Actually, let me take questions from this corner, and then I'll come back to you. So I'll take the gentleman over here, the lady over here, and the lady in red over there, and then I'll come and take you next. Sorry. All right, I'm coming. Sure.
Hi, good morning. My name is James. I'm with the Center for Family and Human Rights Center. My question is for Elizabeth, and throughout the literature, I've heard something similar to the comment you stated of the greater the working population classes and the lower the fertility rates are, the higher the economic status is of a nation. And my question has always been, how can we distinguish between correlation and causation between those two concepts? And I was wondering if you could elucidate further on that point.
I love it. Under a minute. Let's see if others can follow suit. All right. What was it? The lady over there. Okay.
Hi, I'm Judy Bilo, a retired Foreign Service officer, worked a lot in Africa. My question, kind of throwing out in general, what are the mechanisms that you would envision to have this new form of more inclusive and participatory development assistance? How do you get everybody who needs to be around the table adding their particular value added, whether it be women or other disenfranchised groups, African leaders that are already in existence, civil society leaders, and those donors. How do we find our value added? I think it's amply been discussed just how stovepiped and unflexible most U.S. government assistance is, and I think a lot of other donors share these problems. You never get enough money, and when you do, it's the wrong kind of money for the wrong kinds of things. There are multilateral institutions which do wonderful jobs, but often the UN seems to be better at doing documents and statements of purpose rather than implementing. Okay. And then anyone who's worked in the field, you can go out and identify lots and lots of great local organizations with great ideas who know exactly how they can spend $10,000 here or $5,000 there. Right. But the mechanisms, trying to integrate that with donors and what we have and can spend and can administer, how would you scale up some of the very small side problems we have? So what are the actual mechanisms?
All right. We'll have the lady over there. I'll come around. Sorry, I got confused. That's on me. I'll have the lady over there.
Hello, my name is Jesu Samet Oni. I actually work with the Voice of America, but I'm not asking this question as a journalist. I'm speaking as a Nigerian American who has been a little riled up by some of the conversation and even some of the data. When we talk about the issues that are actually affecting people, I know one of the panelists, I believe it was one of the panelists mentioned security is not, one of their talking points. They don't see that as much of a problem. And so when you approach things from this whole overpopulation theme, I wonder if a lot of the people on the ground see this as a problem, because as a Nigerian, I can speak to the fact that a lot of people in my society, in my community, especially in my tribe, women link childbearing with their worth. And so it's not a matter of women don't want birth control and contraceptives, but we actually think it's a blessing to have multiple kids. And when you have one child or no child, you're actually looked down upon in society. And so what I will say is that a lot of people see the problems that are going on, and they actually blame corruption and greed and the fact that there have been all this aid poured into the continent, but it's been stolen, for lack of a better word. And so how do you address development and address funding without addressing good governance, as you mentioned? And how do we continue this narrative of you need to reduce the number of kids you're having when people don't see that as a problem?
Okay, my sister, I think you snuck in two questions. So what I'm going to do is, we got to get everybody to bring to the issue here. So the first question is about correlation and distinction between correlation and cause. The second questions really had to do with, we know where we want to go in inclusivity. Concretely, how do we get there? And then the third question really has to do, and I'm going to focus just on the one, because we can have a discussion about the governance issue. I think it's the cultural framing of the value of a human life and a child in particular, and how this impacts the discussion that we're having here today. Like situating that in terms of where many African women and some African societies are coming from is critically important, that it has to be accounted for in this dialogue. So how do we do that? Quickly, where did I start? Okay, Eze, I'll come with you and then I'll bring it this way, this time.
Okay.
Can you take a minute? Because I see a lot of hands.
Sure.
Pick one.
Okay, on the last question, I think one of the points we are making is to underscore the values that exist already, where you have millions of women who desire to stop childbearing, they are not using family planning. If you can meet that need, you can actually achieve a whole lot. In Africa, it's 1 in 4 women who would want to delay the next birth by at least 2 years or not have any more children, but they are not using family planning. Can you reach them with services and make it accessible to them? We know that it's not just the absence of services. There are many other things that are important. But if we can meet those needs, if we can promote age at marriage and improve it from, in many of the countries, is under 20. that could make a huge difference. All these small things within our norms and values of of the countries that we are looking at, but they can make a big difference.
So basically what you're saying is start with those who already want it. You can work on the larger issue of showing the benefit in smaller families separately, but contextualize within the culture of that society. I think is what you're essentially saying. Elizabeth.
Well, I wanted to answer that one too, but Alex and Mande have covered it beautifully. Just to underscore, we're talking about meeting individuals' stated preferences rather than imposing something upon them. To the first question about correlation and causation and the relationship between economics and population growth, there is a huge, really rigorous literature on this by some very smart demographic economists or economic demographers. And what it shows is that changes in population age structure to have a larger working age population are only the first step. And by no means does that in and of itself bring you faster economic growth. It has to be complemented by what I would argue are some much more challenging and expensive investments in the macroeconomic environment that promote, fiscal stability, trade, shifts into more productive industries. Those are the things that really transform a favorable population age structure into economic growth. And there are several countries that have gone through, a beneficial demographic transition and have not reaped economic rewards, several in Latin America, for example, because they didn't have that second set of requirements in place.
Thank you. Chantal?
Yeah, I would say, norms, including gender norms and norms about institutions such as marriage, how many children you should have, etc., they change. And these norms are not static. And then the question is, how do you get more diverse group of people at the table? Again, it's not rocket science. You invite them and you allow them to vote.
Okay. Phil?
I think on the development side and trying to see how it can be more effective, I think, there's this argument I've given in the past about front-loaded development and back-loaded development assistance. Front-loaded development assistance is what happens usually. You go in, a team goes in from Washington or New York or Brussels or something, and they negotiate a program, and everyone's just hanging out in the Capitol eating good food and talking to ministries, and they come to an agreement, and there's a signing, and everyone signs the agreement, and then the donor agency issues the government a check for its good intentions. And then after about a year, they fall off the program, and they have to come back, and they do another negotiation, and they get another check because they're reinvested their intentions to do something, but they haven't done it. Or you go to a country and you provide assistance after they have taken upon themselves to effect policy change and to do certain things on their own. The MCC program is kind of like that, right? To me, I think we need to look more at that latter type, reinforcing good behavior. Aid does not stop bad behavior, but it can reinforce good behavior. And I think we need to look at that in a way that, from a donor side, but also in terms of the questions that you're raising. I mean, inclusivity. Are all the people at that table for that discussion? So Chantal is right. If they're not there, don't have the discussion until they're there. Invite them. If there's resistance on the part of the government, sometimes a donor just has to say no. There's not what we want to do, but sometimes you have to. And I think it's incumbent upon the governments themselves, if they want these resources, there's some utility in having a broader population, a broader audience presenting itself to the donors of what is that country's need. And I think that's also a beneficial thing to have.
Thank you. Let me swing to this end of the room. And I know I had you up there, so I will come to you. You'll be my third person. Let me start here, right here. Then there's a lady back there, and then I'll come to the woman that I keep saying I'll come to, and then I never do. So you're on next. Right.
I'm Lara McGew. So quick question. How does this conversation change if by security we're also talking about global climate change and how it impacts Africa?
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kara Honzak. I'm from Pathfinder International, and for many years I've worked at the nexus of population, health, and environment, which is a framing for my question. I'm really excited to hear about the macro picture across Africa of what's happening on gender mainstreaming, if you will, under those protocols. And I I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how we sitting here in Washington and those of us who influence donors and other multi-stakeholders can sort of try to open a space for these patriarchal funders to welcome the inclusion of women's health issues, and in particular family planning and some of the other critical health benefits that women need to reach their highest capacity. I think there's a lot of fear and stigma around that. I do think it's a high priority for women, but they often don't bring it forward on the gender agenda or under the gender mainstreaming lens. And so we have to look for a lot of back channels, and it's not working. So if anybody could comment on.
All right, I'll take let me take, okay, so here's where we are. The Wilson Center team in the back there is about to come after me. So work with me because we have to shut off in about 3 minutes. So 30 seconds, just very quickly, raise your point or your comment, and then I'll ask each of our speakers to bring us home with a minute each of concluding remarks, including any one of the questions that you hear in here. All right, so, all right, let's go.
Hi, my name's Indeep Janja. Oh, I'm just going to say it. When it comes to girls' education and the economic empowerment of women, often the women and girls being empowered become the targets of groups and people resistant to this change, to traditional gender roles, and also the seeming westernization of their people. How can we ensure that the women and girls are safe, both inside and outside their homes, as they dare to take advantage of resources like education and job training and even family planning?
All right, can you pass it to the gentleman right next to you?
Quick one that hasn't been mentioned but connects Dr. de Jonge Udrat's point about gender being more than women, and also Dr. Eze's point about child marriages. No one's mentioned the emerging strategy of implementing comprehensive sexuality education. I wonder if there's potential for this in Africa. There's a tremendous amount of research, particularly from the Netherlands, but also from Scandinavian countries and Belgium, and to a limited extent in the United States, that it not only delays sexual initiation, but also improves tolerance of individual differences, including gender differences. Is there potential for this in Africa?
All right, I'll have the lady right behind you if you pass it back to her.
Thank you. Ambassador Carter mentioned armed groups that are ethnically or occupationally bound and bring lawlessness, but often provide justice and security in spaces where the government is not able to. And tying that back to the theme of the event, what is the role of women and girls in these community-based armed groups, and what is the currency of gender in these groups?
Then there's a lady right behind you, I believe. No? Okay, you're good. All right, so education weighs heavy on this last set of questions. And then the question about armed groups for you, Phil, and then the opening up of the space on these patriarchal funders. And so here's what I'm going to do. And because I've been talking about African agency, Alex, you get to go last. Okay. So let me start over here with you, Phil, and then we'll just work it up that way.
Okay. Climate change, Africa is the most affected, but the least able to do anything about it. Okay, that's one. Mm-hmm. With regard to the issue of women's role in some of these ethnic groups, I mean, the fact of it is that most of the violence is male-dominated violence against communities. And I haven't seen much evidence or information regarding the role of women from these communities that are being weaponized, for lack of a better term. In fact, I think, if anything, that they're being more repressed as a result of these actions. And so that has to be attended to. And with regard to the issue of education on sexual issues and education, Africa is generally a very conservative society. And as a result, I think that has to be approached with great delicacy, but it has to be with an African voice. I don't think anything coming from outside the continent is going to be useful. Mm-hmm. I think it's something that has to be created from within African societies itself.
All right, Dr. Chantal.
Yes, so on the reproductive health not being part of the gender agenda or WPS discussion, I think that's actually only true in the US. That's certainly not true in Europe. Second, in terms of violence against women and against girls, often in many countries, law enforcement and the police is part of the problem. Mm-hmm. And I think it's very important to start cleaning up law enforcement forces And one of the ways might be to get actually more women in these police forces. That might actually help with their behavior. And then lastly, I wanted to say something about the stovepiping. We have not talked about the youth, peace and security agenda. In 2015, the UN Security Council launched the Youth, Peace and Security Agenda, much as the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. And it launched this agenda with demographics in mind, and mostly with young men in mind. This agenda is particularly ungendered, I would say, and it is really key that the Youth, Peace and Security Agenda and what I would call the Gender, Peace and Security Agenda, including the SDGs, are really being seen as a whole, because without any of those three, we're not going to make any progress.
Thank you. Ms. Liz.
So on the question about how to keep women and girls safe when promoting development, I think that comes back to an issue that we've sort of circled around many times today, which is the importance of local leadership in these discussions and local champions. And I would just reference that, for example, in the family planning space, there's been tremendous success in engaging religious leaders in communities, for example, in coming forth and talking to people about what the scriptures do and do not say, and sort of overcoming myths and misconceptions about whether family planning is permissible. So you do need to just sort of look for and identify and cultivate those local champions whose voices are very well listened to. Bob, on your question about comprehensive sexuality education, so I would encourage you to take a look at PRB's Youth Family Planning Policy Scorecard, which does an in-depth dive of how 16 countries, 15 of which are in Africa, have integrated CSE or not in their policy frameworks. And having just returned this spring and last fall from kind of doing some field work in one of those countries, where the sexuality education policy only allows the concept of contraception to be introduced in school in the final year of secondary school. I would reiterate that words matter, and that on the policy front, you can often introduce many of these concepts as long as you don't use loaded terms. And unfortunately, CSE itself has become a really loaded term.
All right, Alex, bring us home.
Thank you. Maybe two very quick points to make. I think Africa needs to be at the table in terms of talking about what its needs are. And I do agree with you. I think we need to separate our humanitarian assistance programs, which is the dominant form of whatever we are doing, from real development. And development should happen where countries are actually leading and making investments. I mean, the World Bank gives you concessionary loans if you're in crisis, not if you are at the point where you can make the transition. Gavi leaves you dry if you're actually making progress. And so the whole model needs to be rethought. If we are interested in development in Africa, can we actually identify the countries that are making progress and support them to become leading countries on the continent? I think it begins to change and challenge the other countries, because they like to compare against each other. But there's very limited models to look at, say, okay, this one has really made it and has moved, except the very small countries like Mauritius and Seychelles and all that. And so let's invest in development, and let's think about African leadership in that, countries that are committed to it, and invest and support them to really make that transition and the leap forward. And I think we begin to see this success story replicate itself in different other places. And then we can do everything we've done in development so far, which is responding to a lot of the crises and the emergencies and things like that as a separate trajectory of development. I think we need a conversation around that.
All right. Look, I'm really sorry I couldn't get to all of you. This has been a fantastic, fantastic discussion. I liked the way the speakers complemented each other, but also some of the tension points on some of the issues and the framing of the issues and the analysis of the issues. I think this is really important to us continuing this discussion and figuring out how we go from here. So with that, I really do hope that our speakers are going to be available for a few more minutes. You can engage them out there. But for now, I'd just like to ask that you please join me, first of all, in thanking ECSP for putting this together, but thanking our speakers for a wonderful job. So Dr. Alex, Ms. Elizabeth, Dr. Chantal, Ambassador Phil, hopefully we'll have you back again at some point to continue this discussion. And to all of you, thank you so much for joining us here today. And thank you to the ECSP team and the Africa Program team. Thank you.